Donald Trump decided to bomb Iran. Was the president simply pissed off with his taco reputation? Trump always chickens out. Or has he got a longer term plan for the Middle East? And where does the unilateral action from the States and Israel leave international institutions? Are NATO and the UN now simply moribund, outdated talking shops? I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Yay, it worked.
To the Downtown Den Politics Podcast with me, Frank McKenna, joined this week by Jo Phillips, who has just been informing us that she was once sacked by Kelvin McKenzie. We'll get into that story at some point in the future, I'm sure, but she's gone up even higher in my estimation. So well done, Jo. And Kevin Johnson, who is our man in Birmingham, and of course the head honcho at Urban Comms over there in the West Midlands. Jim Hancock, still plugged in, still low battery, hopefully will be with us next week. Right, so obviously lots and lots of things happening on the geopolitical front over the past 7 days, which impacts hugely on the UK, Europe, and of course the world. And so we're switching this week's 2 episodes. We usually do domestic affairs on the Monday and then turn our attention to world affairs on the Tuesday. But things have moved so fast over the past 7 days that we thought it wise for us to focus in today on what's happening, particularly in the Middle East and the United States, Donald Trump's decision to bomb Iran. This on the back of, obviously, an Israeli attack on Iran. And we were told that Donald Trump was going to take a fortnight to consider his next steps. And during that 2-week period, Iran were going to be encouraged to go back to the negotiating table because, of course, let us remind ourselves that just prior to the Israeli bombing of Iran, that first one a couple of weeks back, that very weekend, they were supposed to be sitting down for talks to negotiate around Iran's move towards potentially producing nuclear arms. Now, this attack by the United States, they've obviously thrown their full weight behind Netanyahu and Israel in this regard. Let me put the case for the attack rather than the case for the defence. Which is they are convinced Iran was close to producing nuclear weapons. Donald Trump has said that he thinks that they are a threat to not just Israel, but to the West as a whole. And Netanyahu has been making this claim since 1992. And to be fair to Israel, Iran have very publicly said that their objective, one of them, is to wipe Israel off the face of the map. So we are not talking here about a friendly state that has never made threats against their near neighbours. And of course, what has been going on for 3 decades or more is an awful lot of what we would probably, in the big scheme of things, call spats, but nevertheless many people have been injured and killed during those spats between Iran and Israel. They are probably the 2 major powers in that particular part of the world, and there has often been the potential for something to come to a head, and it seems that has happened now. And the final point I'm going to make before I bring you in, Kevin, first on this, is that Israel will have been watching what's been happening in Iran forever. They've always thought that they were under threat from that state, and they will have seen over the past 12 months in particular a significant dissembling of that state's strength. So Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis have all been taken out up to a point. And I think it's been proved through the Gaza conflict that Iran is not necessarily as strong as some people have presumed. And therefore, Netanyahu will say that strategically now is absolutely the right time to strike because Israel is in a position of strength, Iran is in a position of weakness, and Trump will then say alongside that, this is the best time to attack in order to bring Iran to the negotiating table. So I've laid out as best I can what I think the main issues are. Let me just get your reflections, Kevin, on what's happened over the past 7 days.
Well, two things to begin with, Frank. There's much to unpack in all of this, and I agree. Obviously, we talked about this last week in last week's podcast, didn't we? That because of what Israel has been able to do, and with America's backing, particularly when it comes to the Houthis, they've sort of cleared the table, haven't they? Hezbollah, Hamas become less effective. Houthis have been attacked, and we've seen before Saturday, come Sunday. We've seen before that Iran's defences are not what we might have thought for a sort of superpower in that region. So you can see the rationale for it in that respect, although you can make the same argument to say that's the right time to then try and drag them to the table once they've weakened to that point. But I think two things I'd say, really. One is, my God, its defences are not up to much, are Iran. We saw this, we said this last week, didn't we, in terms of the Israel attacks. They've got very little defence, and Israel had very quick command over Tehran's airspace. And then we saw, particularly from the briefing at the Pentagon yesterday, in military terms, it would seem impressive attack from America came up with no defence from the Iranians whatsoever. I mean, they saw not so much as a hot air balloon as they whisked over to take these 3 nuclear sites out. So I think for all the talk of Iran, and no doubt it wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, which gives the US some kind of rationale for going in. I mean, really, what is the state of its military? What is the state of its defences? Not very impressive for the kind of country with the kind of rhetoric it has had. I think the other thing, and you may want to unpack this far more, but the other thing that strikes me this morning, Frank, is listening to David Lammy on the Today programme and other media coverage of it this morning. I mean, this government does not really want to get too close to saying we agree with Donald and we're glad they went in and we'd have done the same if it was us. I mean, they really are trying to hedge their bets this morning. They're obviously not defending Iran or defending Iran's capabilities or desires, but they really are sitting on the fence, largely, far less so than, say, the Australians are when it comes to the action that Iran has taken. And we see that, you know, for all of Starmer's, I think, quite impressive work to stay close to Trump, in the end, it matters not a jot, does it? Trump is going to make his own decisions with whatever small team of advisors around him. He's going to make his own decisions. So we were nowhere, and we're trying to pick up the pieces. And for a state which wants to annihilate another state, Iran isn't really up to much, is it?
And I think the point that you make there, latterly, Kevin, in terms of the UK's role or lack of in this is an important one. But I would extend that, Joe, to include almost the rest of the world, because we saw a G7 summit last week that was basically Trump went along for half an hour, made the points he wanted to make, signed a deal with Keir Starmer, dropped a load of blank sheets of paper on the floor with Keir Starmer, I think, stupidly scrabbled to pick up rather than just leave them for someone else to collect. Didn't make a great photograph, did that one. And then he sort of got on a plane, went home, leaving the rest of them to talk about what? Well, they don't appear to have any power whatsoever. We've got a NATO summit this week. Again, what are they going to talk about? United Nations have not been approached to talk about whether or not this war is legal, legitimate. We all remember the tortuous negotiations and talks that went on before US decided to attack Iraq back in the early noughties, of course. And I just wonder whether we are starting to see the whole collapse of the world order of international law, because in Donald Trump, in Vladimir Putin, we have two very powerful players who, quite frankly, don't give a jot about what the international courts say.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And the other person you didn't mention is Netanyahu. Now, as you rightly said, he has been saying that Iran's about to obliterate Israel for decades. There is no evidence to suggest that they were any nearer to making a nuclear bomb or having that capability last week than there was the week before. And in fact, as Kevin pointed out, what it's shown is Iran's weakness militarily, which then begs the question, well, maybe they haven't even got a nuclear weapon or a nuclear capability. So my view, and you can call me an old cynic if you like, is that Netanyahu has done this as a totally diversionary tactic because it's got everybody looking over there and not talking about Gaza, which plays into the point that you just made, Frank, that nobody gives a damn anymore about what other people think. You know, Netanyahu's government has been criticised and attacked from countries all over the world, from the UN, from charities, from, all sorts of respected organisations. And he doesn't care. He continues to kill and torture Palestinian people in Gaza. And, what's the best way to do? Well, let's stop people talking about it. We don't want them talking about it. So let's do something else. And Donald, he's so stupid. He'll do what we want to do because he can have a medal for going bullseye. It is really, really shocking that nobody, and what we've got is these willy waving warmongers, Trump, Putin, Netanyahu, you've got India and Pakistan, and who knows what's going on in China. And they all are playing a game. They don't stop and think about the consequences. I mean, the massive consequences of this, of course, is if Iran closes the Straits of Hormuz to shipping. That's 20% of the world's oil and energy projects. Well, what's that going to do to global economies, including Trump's? And what's that going to do to his voters and his supporters? Because he promised he would never get involved in an overseas war. And just the one point I'd make, so he goes to the G7, has dinner, sits next to Keir Starmer, says, oh, no, I'm not going to do anything. Keir Starmer comes back in good faith and says, no, I'm pretty sure he's not going to do anything, which means you cannot do business with him. Mm. And that's the difficulty, that where if decent countries, democratic countries who believe in the rule of international law and respect it, if they have no influence, then where do we go from here?
And I think that is the big problem, really, isn't it? When you look at the whole picture here, okay, we've got these really, really dangerous conflicts taking place, and we don't want to start people's week off too depressing a mood, but equally nobody who's got half a brain cannot see how dangerous the world is at this moment in time. But then when you look at the domestic situation in terms of what the UK's influence is, and you compare and contrast, for example, Thatcher and Reagan's relationship, or Blair and Clinton, or Blair and Bush, which was arguably even closer when it came to the international situation. We're not on the pitch, Kevin, are we? And you could say the same about President Macron. You could say the same about Merz in Germany. You can name any other world leader almost. I mean, Carney, okay, similar to Starmer. He's had a good play in terms of the way in which he's handled Trump. But ultimately, if the President of the United States decides, I ain't going to pay any attention to my allies, or my traditional allies, I'll put it that way, I'm not going to go and talk to these huge organisations that, in his view, simply stop progress. And why would I, with the biggest army on the planet, be worried about what anybody else thinks?
Well, he seemingly would only really worries about other dictators. You might say that the President Trump is duly elected, and of course he is this time around, but he really, we all know, is infatuated with Putin, China, North Korea. We saw in the first time round, didn't we, how sort of infatuated he got with the North Korean leader and lovely letters he had from him, etc. I think if the Ayatollah in the last few days has said, yes, we'll meet in Turkey or Geneva or wherever, this would have been Trump's route to the Nobel Peace Prize, wasn't it? He likes to deal one-on-one with people who he finds impressive, have got absolute command of their countries, or seemingly have got absolute command of their countries. He doesn't want bureaucracy. He doesn't want long meetings, does he? I saw the coverage of the G7 last week. You've got to keep things really short for him. Hour and a half at most, not long meetings that go on, hour after hour. Your only hope, I think, to some degree, is that, well, two things. One is a bit like Starmer, Macron tried to do with the coalition of the willing, is that Europe, in that case, takes on more and more of the responsibility for supporting Ukraine more by itself and slightly less reliant on the states over time, although that's very difficult to do for all kinds of reasons of surveillance, intelligence and military supply. And of course, the man has only got, whatever it is, 3.5 years to go, perhaps, if he adheres to the Constitution, and that he's always got a political base to keep happy. Now, his poll ratings is not great, and no doubt the action taken on Saturday, Sunday is going to splinter both his MAGA base and the Republican Party more generally. So as time goes on, that will get more and more difficult, won't it? As the kind of decisions he makes, either domestic or foreign, will begin to split apart his base. And so he'll have more people to worry about in that sense, and no doubt, parts of his administration will begin to splinter as people are sacked or resign, etc. But yes, I think there's a much bigger threat, but perhaps an opportunity, in terms of the world institutions, G7, UN, etc. Is that there needs to be a reshaping, a reorganisation of some of those institutions to try and bring some kind of order, such as it can be, to the world. And maybe Starmer and the likes of Macron have got a role to play there to try and reimagine how we do make sure there is multilateral action on the things that affect the globe the most.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Kevin. How long do Starmer, Macron and co hang around hoping that Trump is going to in some way move into a more traditional presidential role? And it's just not going to happen. And, within this first 6 months, is it now, we've seen the way in which his inconsistent behaviour impacts on the UK, Europe and elsewhere. So you take his economic policy in terms of tariffs and the impact that had. And even going over and waving a letter from King Charles, it buys you a couple of days, decent headlines in the press, but the following week he can stand up and make an announcement that totally blows any deals that you've made with him out of the water anyway. So for me, and this may be happening behind the scenes, of course, people like Carney, Macron, Starmer, even Maloney need to be having a real plan of action, in my view, to say, how can we coalesce around a new group of countries that actually begin to act in a more united way than has been the case up until this point? And whether or not you can then utilise the existing organisations such as the United Nations, Joe, I'm not sure. But equally, we can't simply sit back and wait for the next 3.5 years to unfold and see what happens next, because, well, again, not to wish to put people off the cornflakes, but in 3.5 years' time, a lot of the world might not be here.
Well, exactly, for a variety of reasons. I mean, as we're talking, Iran's foreign minister is in Moscow for talks with Putin, about how they respond to the common threats and common enemies. Now, where does that place Trump with his buddy Vladimir? Because Putin will side with Iran against America and against Israel, and he'll play them all like, chess pieces. I mean, I just think this is a real opportunity, and God knows it's hard to find any silver linings because the clouds are very dark at the moment. But this is a real opportunity for a resetting of the European bloc, if you like. And that includes the Nordic countries as well as the 27 members. And I think, you've actually got some very pragmatic and sensible people, including Italy's Giorgia Meloni, who has proved to be not the right-wing loon that she seemed to be when she was campaigning, but she seems to have a good relationship. She seems to be quite collaborative and collegiate. You've got Callas, who you mentioned, you've got Merz in Germany, you've got Macron, who's actually, doing quite a lot of the heavy lifting. And all of these people have got problems going on domestically, but they are coming together. And you throw into the mix, Mark Carney from Canada and Australia as well, and New Zealand. And you begin to see that actually America could become, it's a massive country, obviously, but it could become quite isolated. And I think the point that Kevin made about the lashback or the rejection of what Trump's doing from his own supporters. I mean, when you have Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is so far right of Donald Trump, she's gone around the houses and come back again. And she said, this is bonkers. You promised we'd never get it. They don't care about the issues. They don't want to be involved in a foreign war. And there will be, I would say, some sort of an attack or retaliation, whether it's in America itself or whether it's in American interests around the world. And that will have a huge impact on Trump's popularity. And people will then begin to question his judgment. And then that allows people to go, well, hang on a minute, you said this and you did that. And I think what we could do with here, just very quickly, instead of the anti-Starmer press going, oh, he was blindsided by Trump. Remember, as Kevin alluded to, the fabulous relationship between Reagan and Thatcher. She wasn't told about America going into Grenada all those years ago. So, there's nothing new here. There's nothing to see. What you see is actually Trump is an absolute nitwit who doesn't believe one thing from the minute it's come out of his mouth to the minute he's talking to somebody else. And the sooner that we, all of us in Europe, begin to rebuild and reshape, it's better for Europe, it's better for Britain, and it's actually going to be better for the world.
It's interesting that you mentioned Australia, Joe, because Albanese actually has been the leader who has come out firmly in favour of the bombing of Iran. And of course, Albanese, to remind listeners, is a Labour Prime Minister. So I think that will have been a surprise to some. Australia, of course, watch this particular situation with far more interest than we do, given the geographical proximity and so on. But nevertheless, I was a little surprised by that announcement. But let me just put Trump's case, as far as this is concerned, as best I can. He will say that Iran is weak and has been proved to be weak over the past 2 years, that it has always been seen as a potential threat, whether that was through the Bush presidency, the Obama presidency, and so on and so forth. Of course, Obama had a slightly different way of managing this and lifted sanctions and got a deal with them so that we could go in and investigate what they were up to. But, Trump sadly ripped that particular deal up. Nonetheless, he will say they always have been a threat to Israel and therefore to Western allies. And he will now hope that Iran do come to the negotiating table. And my guess is he's having back-channel conversations with Putin to say, look, mate, we've stayed out of the Ukraine thing, so you carry on doing what you want there. Europe will oppose you and Ukraine will carry on fighting, but we ain't getting involved. But you just let me carry on doing what I'm doing in Iran. I don't think Putin has got the bandwidth to get involved in the Middle East. I think he's got enough going on with Ukraine. So I can't see Putin intervening other than to suggest, actually, Iran, you need to go back to the negotiating table. And if they do that, then Trump is going to be looking like a bit of a strategic genius, Kevin, because he will say, look, there you go. We've had all these negotiations for 20 years. You've had your United Nations, your NATOs, your Obamas going in trying to... We've sorted this out. We've got the Ayatollah to come to the negotiating table, scrap his nuclear plans, and we can all move forward happily ever after together. And by the way, give us me Nobel Peace Prize. We'll come back to that with Joe in a second. That is the way he is hoping it plays out, isn't it? That is his basic plan in terms of if you were looking at this from an optimistic perspective.
Yes, and probably at some stage the Iranians will come to the table, won't they? And whatever guise that is, whether that's with the Americans, whether that's with the European powers, whether Russia is involved in that, as it was the first time around that you alluded to, Frank. Who knows? But I mean, I suppose the real test is, does it really eliminate all efforts to develop nuclear bomb capability? And perhaps even more important than that, does it take away its stated ambition to wipe Israel off the face of the map? Is what happened Saturday, Sunday going to bring about those two results? I can't see it myself. I can see it bringing people around the table and having, lovely meals, but in the end, is it going to make any much greater difference? Now, probably. I mean, I do think it is quite notable that that the battle damage assessment was not revealed at the Pentagon briefing yesterday. There were a few have come out since, I think, through other satellite sources. But usually at those Pentagon briefings, you'd get the kind of the big pictures, wouldn't you? Get the images from the plane cockpit and all the rest of it, as to we've taken out this site, we've taken out this bunch of servicemen, or whatever it is. You got none of that yesterday. And it's very limited. No, that may, of course, be because the stuff is so buried deep below the surface. You can't actually get a camera on it. But I thought it was quite telling that so far there is no incontrovertible evidence that it has had the sort of bullseye annihilation effect that Trump said. And of course, we don't know that materials weren't moved in advance of these attacks happening. So I think the other thing, now I go back to what Joe says, and obviously, clearly, I'm not wishing this for anything whatsoever, but 9/11 was a sort of consequence, wasn't it? It was the build-up of other events, other military events, other terrorist attacks that took place before that on a much reduced level compared to 9/11. The sort of tit for tat, the sort of game of dominoes that goes on after these things. Iran doesn't have to have great defense of the skies. It may have been about a year away from a nuclear bomb. There might be some assessments that say that, but it can disrupt, can't it? Either directly or through its agents, even though those agents are much depleted. And of course, the strait that Joe was talking about, it can cause damage. And also in the cyber world as well, it can cause damage and disruption. And of course, it is capable indirectly of causing great terrorist atrocities on other lands, including presumably both here and in the US. Now, if and when such things happen, whether they're on the scale of 9/11 or a more traditional terrorist atrocity, if we can put it in those terms, what will public opinion do and what will Trump do in those circumstances? So I think that's the test, isn't it? Not whether Iran can wipe Israel off the face of the earth in the next 12 months, not whether it can launch a nuclear bomb, not whether it's going to whether it's going to come back to the table or not. But really, Iran is not going to go quietly, is it? It is not going to not undertake any kind of military or indirect terrorist attacks as a result of what happened on Saturday or Sunday. And that really is going to be, what we're all watching out for, and will have a big impact on what comes next.
Yeah, and interestingly, Kevin, I know that it was said that radiation levels didn't change at all in Iran in terms of the atmosphere there. So that would suggest that there wasn't a big explosion of nuclear. But I don't know how these things play out. And as you say, I'm sure more will be revealed over the next few days. Again, let me just play this scenario out to you, though, in terms of the case you've just made there, Kevin, which I will fully, of course, endorse. It's not necessarily that Iran are going to be sending planes across good old Blighty anytime soon, dropping bombs on us, but it's that terrorism that we know they are capable of. And we said last week, the greatest recruitment tool that the terrorists have had over the past 12 months has been the way in which Israel has approached the Gaza war. So take that into account. And I do note with some interest people like Bannon in the States, for example, saying initially they didn't want the United States to get involved at all, but rowing back a little over the past 48 hours to say, oh, well, okay, if that one strike gets Iran round the negotiating table, that's fine. I think there will be a problem for Trump if they start to get into more engagement. If there was an attack on American bases, for example, I think perversely he would be less concerned about a terrorist attack in America, because I think he would use that to continue his attack on foreign travel, basically getting a load of people into vans through ICE and sending them on the merry way if they're Muslim, because we can't have this existential threat into our own country. So I think the domestic thing is a bit messy. It would absolutely, of course, Kevin, you're right. People would be horrified if there were terrorist attacks on American soil again. But I think Trump would use that in that horrible way that he uses these situations. Yeah, I think in terms of the players around that table that you look at, Rubio seems to just be doing whatever he's told. Hesketh, likewise, he's Trump's puppet. The interesting character in all this, I think, is J.D. Vance, because he has been, and I used the phrase nuanced, and Kevin said Trump doesn't know the meaning of it, but J.D. Vance does. And he's been quite careful in terms of his public pronouncements. He said things like, well, I trust the president's instincts. But of course, that doesn't stop you in a few months' time saying, well, the president's instincts were wrong, guys. So I think Vance could be an important player in all of this. But I don't know that we can say how this is going to play out domestically for Trump. It could actually be a positive for him.
Well, it could, Frank, except he has moved, on the success or not, whether we believe him or not, of this bullseye hit. And you can almost imagine him sitting there like Dr. Strangelove, sitting there watching it on a video screen with his baseball cap on and a giant bag of fries. He's now started talking about regime change, and that moves it into a completely different arena, because, okay, I personally don't agree with it, but they've done a hit. They've nullified the nuclear capability if indeed it was there. But once you start talking about regime change, what does that mean? Well, then we've seen how marvelously that's worked in Afghanistan and Libya, across the world, mainly at the behest of the Americans. And I think at that point, and you've already heard it in the sort of snippets from news coverage of Iranians who, of course, hate everything that is happening under their regime, but they don't want bloody Israel or America to tell them who to vote for. Yeah. And I think, if Trump goes down that route, then he is really embroiling America, and you will end up with American boots on the ground.
The final point I'll come back to is the one that we sort of got into earlier, where it leaves international law, where it leaves NATO, United Nations, and also going back to one of the points that Kevin raised earlier about whether Trump will take any note of the American Constitution, because, of course, Congress ought to have been consulted before these bombings took place. And again, Trump just decided to ignore that particular protocol as well. And I suppose, we can take some comfort in the UK and Europe to say, well, he's not even talking to his own political influences, never mind us. But are we starting to see the beginning of the end of that world order, Kevin, that we've been so used to since 1945? Now, of course, we have seen, conflicts rage during that period of time, but you've always felt that there was an accountability in place, even for those superpowers. And now you are starting to look at those institutions and think, actually, guys, you're meeting, but it's words, no action, and no real consequence for the people who ignore what you say.
Yeah, I don't think we can give up on them. And to take that at face value, Frank, that would devalue an awful lot of good work that the United Nations does in various guises. And the United Nations is about more than peacekeeping, although obviously at the heart of it is trying to keep world order and peace. But it does an awful lot of other very good things. But you've got a system with the Security Council and 5 members. Now, we'd have said a few, months ago, 2 of those members you can't rely on in terms of Russia and China, because they will always vote with their strategic interests and not going to care too much about whether you've got an issue with democracy somewhere else in the world, as they're 2 countries that don't really, do much democracy. Now you'd say you've got 3 Security Council permanent members, i.e. Trump, around a table, meaning you can't really get agreement on anything then most of the sort of liberalish world would agree upon. So at some point, somebody has to tackle that. The system of a United Nations, a Security Council of 5 permanent members, which we rejoice in being part of that P5, that is not working, is it? And I think others over the last period have had a bit of a go at that, raised some stuff at the flagpole. It might have been Cameron or one of the many recent prime ministers we've had has sort of raised it as something that needs to be looked at. Clearly, it needs to be looked at. Is it going to get anywhere while you've got Putin and Trump in particular in power? I don't think so. So you do need other institutions, don't you? Joe referenced earlier the Nordic countries. This is why you got joint expeditionary forces and all kinds of other loose or slightly less loose organisations and corporations going on, because we all realise that, whether it's the UN or the G7 or any other institution, by themselves are not going to achieve aims which more than one country believe in. But we've got to stick to it. I think the other thing is that, just go back to the whole, was Starmer informed, etc. I think if he was informed just before, but he didn't have much influence over it, I think he's probably got a massive sigh of relief to some degree that Diego Garcia wasn't brought into it. Now, whether that came about because the nod was given to America, please, for goodness sake, don't ask us, because it's either going to make life too difficult or we're going to have to say no, or you're just going to have to ignore us and let the planes take off regardless. He must be, issuing a huge sigh of relief that whole business has not, come to pass, and the Americans found another way of doing it. And I think he'll be grateful in a way that he wasn't really consulted on it. He was advised at some point, but he wasn't really consulted on at the end. He can slightly wash his hands of it, but benefit perhaps from the results of it if they have had the annihilating impact on the nuclear capability of Iran. But that doesn't mean the consequences of what happened Saturday, Sunday aren't going to wash onto our shores.
Yeah, international law, Joe, does it matter anymore? Because I think, Israel now have definitely, I think you can say, committed war crimes. Russia, of course, have. I think you can put the United States into that category by any reasonable measure that you want to view the attack that they've made on Iran. But of course, you were telling us that Pakistan have nominated Donald for a Nobel Peace Prize. Yes. So perhaps, we're looking at this from a totally wrong perspective.
This is obviously why the 3 of us have never been nominated, because clearly the way to get a nomination is to start a war or act at the behest of somebody else who might be your buddy, who might let you then go and build a strip of, super duper houses where you've just eliminated an entire population of people. It is staggering. Of course, Obama got the Nobel Peace Prize, and that's always hugely pissed off Trump. But this is a man who's got no consequence. And I think, sadly, the UN has done itself no favours over the years, because it is a talking shop. And, we're all gripped by news and politics, and we will probably sit and look at those live proceedings. But actually, there's a point where you think, has anyone got a hot teaspoon so I can take my eyeballs out? Because it's got to be better than, looking at this and listening to it and it coming up with nothing. I mean, there is no action. And I think the trouble is that the world has changed so much, not just geopolitically, but in the way that people expect their politicians to behave. They want it instantly because they're used to click and collect or next day delivery. So, what you've got is there is no room and no space anymore for the diplomatic nuances, the back channels, the negotiations, the manoeuvring that has probably prevented an awful lot of catastrophes and indeed caused a lot of terrible mistakes, on our behalf and other countries around the world. But if you don't have the UN, if you don't have the International Criminal Court, if you don't have the World Health Organization, if you don't have the International Red Cross and all of those organizations, well, what you do have is the Wild West. And I think, there's enough cowboys around. We need to lasso some of them and stick them in a corral.
Well, on that note, howdy, partner. We will end our Monday Downtown Den Politics podcast. And sorry, as I say, if we've had to go a little too serious for you for the start of the week, but I'm sure you'll recognise that we are living in very dangerous times, and it was an issue that did need to be covered by us today. So we'll be back tomorrow, and we'll be turning our attentions to all things domestic UK. The government have presented on Monday a new industrial strategy, so we'll be looking at that. We'll be looking at the fallout from Keir Starmer's decision to launch a national inquiry into grooming gangs, and I'm sure we'll be having a word or two about Joe's mate Nigel as well. So join us again tomorrow. Enjoy the next 24 hours. Have a good start to the week. We'll be back soon.